Extrusion of the moon. One must be quite clear about the fact that only later did man assume the dense substantiality which he has today, and that he did this very gradually. If one wants to form an idea of his corporeality on the level of development which is being discussed, one can best do this by imagining it as similar to water vapor or to a cloud suspended in the air. But of course this idea approaches reality in a completely external way, for the fire cloud man is internally alive and organized. In comparison to what man became later, however, one must imagine him at this stage as in a state of soul slumber, and as only very dimly conscious. Everything which can be called intelligence, understanding, reason, is lacking in this being. Floating, rather than striding, it moves forward, aside, backward, to all sides, by means of 4 limb-like organs. For the rest, something has already been said about the soul of this being. One must not think, however, that the movements or vital activities of these beings occurred in an irrational or irregular fashion. On the contrary, they were completely regular. Everything which happened had sense and significance, but the directing force of understanding was not in the beings themselves. They were directed by an understanding which was outside of them. Higher, more mature beings than they surrounded and directed them. For the important basic quality of the fire mist was that on the level of their existence, which we have characterized, human beings could embody themselves in it, but that at the same time, higher beings also could take on a body in it and could enter into a fully reciprocal relationship with men. Man had brought his impulses, instincts, and passions to the point where they could be formed in the fire mist. The other beings mentioned, however, could create within this fire mist by means of their reason and their intelligent activity. These beings had higher capacities by which they reached into the upper regions. Their decisions and impulses emanated from these regions, but the actual effects of these decisions appeared in the fire mist. Everything men did on earth resulted from the regular association of the fire mist body with that of these higher beings. One can say that man was striving to ascend. He was to develop qualities in the fire mist which in a human sense were higher than those he had previously possessed. The other beings, however, were striving downward toward the material. They were on the way to bringing their creative powers to bear on increasingly dense material forms. This does not represent a degradation for them in the broader sense of the term. One must be quite clear on this point. It requires a higher power and capacity to direct denser forms of substantiality than to control those less dense. In earlier periods of their development, these higher beings, too, had had a limited power like that of man today. Like present-day man, they once had power only over what took place within them. At that time, coarse, external matter did not obey them. Now, they were striving toward a condition in which they were to direct outer events magically. Thus, they were ahead of man in the period described. Man strove upward in order that he might first embody the understanding in more refined matter, so that later it could act toward the external. They had already incorporated the understanding into themselves at an earlier period, and now received magic power in order to articulate the understanding into the world around them. Man was moving upward through the stage of the fire mist. They were penetrating downward through the same stage, toward an extension of their power. Those forces especially, which man knows as the forces of his lower passions or impulses, can be active in the fire mist. Man, as well as the higher beings, makes use of these forces at the stage of the fire mist. These forces act in such a way within the human form described above that man can develop the organs which enable him to think, and thus to develop a personality. On the other hand, these forces work in the higher beings at this stage in such a manner that they can employ them impersonally to create their arrangements of the earth. In this way, forms which are images of the rules of the understanding come into existence on earth through these beings. Through the action of the forces of passion, organs of personal understanding develop in man. Through the same forces, organizations filled with wisdom develop around him. One should now imagine this process to be somewhat further advanced, or rather one should represent to oneself what is written in the Akasha Chronicle concerning a somewhat later point in time. At that moment the moon split off from the earth. This event caused a great revolution. The objects which surround man lost a great part of their heat. These objects thereby entered into a coarser and denser substantiality. Man must live in this cooler environment. He can do this only if he changes his own substantiality. With this densification of substance is connected a change in form, for the condition of fire mist on earth has been replaced by a completely different state. As a consequence, the higher beings which we have described no longer have the fire mist available to them as a medium for their activity. Now they can no longer exercise their influence on those soul activities of man, which had previously constituted their main field of action. They have received power over the forms of man which they themselves had previously created from the fire mist. This change in influence goes hand in hand with the transformation of the human form. One half of this form, together with two organs of movement, now becomes the lower half of the body, which functions mainly as the carrier of nutrition and reproduction. The other half of this form is turned upward, so to speak. The remaining two organs of movement become the rudiments of hands. Those organs which previously had served for nutrition and reproduction are transformed into organs of speech and thought. Man has become upright. This is the immediate consequence of the extrusion of the moon. With the moon, all those forces disappeared from the earth through which, during his fire mist period, man could still impregnate himself and produce beings like himself without external influence. His whole lower half, that which one often calls the lower nature, now came under the rationally formative influence of the higher entities. What these entities previously could regulate within man, since the mass of forces now split off with the moon was then still combined with the earth, they now have to organize through the interaction of the two sexes. It is therefore understandable that the moon is regarded by the initiates as the symbol of the force of reproduction. After all, these forces do inhere in it, so to speak. The higher beings we have described have an affinity with the moon, are in a sense moon gods. Before the separation of the moon and through its power, they acted within man. Afterwards, their forces acted from outside on the reproduction of man. One could also say that those noble spiritual forces which previously had acted on the still higher impulses of man through the medium of the fire mist, had now descended in order to exercise their power in the area of reproduction. Indeed, noble and divine forces exercise a regulating and organizing action in this area. With this, an important proposition of the secret doctrine has been expressed, namely the higher, more noble divine forces have an affinity with the apparently lower forces of human nature. The word apparently must here be understood in its full significance, for it would be a complete misconception of occult truths if one were to see something base in the forces of reproduction as such. Only when man misuses these forces, when he compels them to serve his passions and instincts, is there something pernicious in them, but not when he ennobles them, through the insight that a divine spiritual power lies in them. Then he will place these forces at the service of the development of the earth, and through his forces of reproduction, he will carry out the intentions of the higher entities we have characterized. Mystery science teaches that this whole subject is to be ennobled, is to be placed under divine laws, but is not to be mortified. The latter can only be the consequence of occult principles which have been understood in a purely external fashion and distorted into a misconceived asceticism. It will be seen that in his upper half, man has developed something upon which the higher beings we have described have no influence. Other beings now acquire power over this upper half. In earlier stages of their development, these beings advance further than men, but not as far as the moon gods. They could not exercise their power in the mist, but now that something they themselves had lacked previously has been formed in the human organs of understanding through the fire mist, their time has come. At an earlier time, the moon gods had attained an understanding capable of acting externally. This understanding already existed in them when the period of the fire mist began. They could act externally on the things of earth. In earlier times, the lower beings we have just mentioned had not attained such an understanding which acts outwardly. Therefore, the time of the fire mist found them unprepared. Now, however, an understanding is present. It exists in men. These beings seize upon this human understanding in order to act on the things of earth by means of it. As the moon gods previously had acted on the whole man, they now act only on his lower half, while the influence of the lower entities just mentioned acts on his upper half. Thus man comes under a double leadership. In his lower part, he is under the power of the moon gods. In his developed personality, however, he comes under the leadership of those entities which are summed up under the name Lucifer, the name of their regent. The Luciferic gods thus complete their own development by making use of the awakened human powers of understanding. Previously, they had not been able to attain this level. At the same time, they give man the predisposition to freedom, to the discrimination between good and evil. While it is true that the human organ of understanding has been formed entirely under the leadership of the moon gods, these gods would have left it to slumber. They were not interested in making use of it. They possess their own powers of understanding. In their own interest, the Luciferic beings were concerned with developing the human understanding and directing it toward the things of earth. Thereby, for men, they became the teachers of all that can be accomplished by the human understanding. But they could not be anything more than stimulators. They could not develop an understanding within themselves, but only in man. Thus there developed two directions of activity on earth. One proceeded directly from the moon divinities, and was lawfully regulated and rational from the very beginning. The moon gods had already served their apprenticeship, and were now beyond the possibility of error. The Luciferic gods which acted on men had yet to win their way to such illumination. With their guidance, man had to learn to find the laws of his being. Under Lucifer's leadership, he himself had to become as one of the gods. Here the question arises, if in their development the Luciferic entities had not reached the stage of intelligent creation in the fire mist, at what stage had they stopped? To what point in earth development were they able to work together with the moon gods? The Akasha Chronicle gives information on this. They could participate in earthly creation up to the point at which the sun split off from the earth. It appears that while they performed somewhat lesser work than the moon gods up to this time, nevertheless, they belonged to the host of divine creators. After the separation of earth and sun, an activity began on the earth, the work in the fire mist, for which only the moon gods, but not the Luciferic spirits, were prepared. Therefore, a period of pause and of waiting began for these spirits. The Luciferic spirits could emerge once more from their state of rest when the human beings began to work at the development of their organs of understanding after the ebbing of the general fire mist. For the creation of the understanding is related to the activity of the sun. The dawn of the understanding in human nature is the lighting up of an inner sun. This is said not only in a metaphorical, but also in a quite real sense. When the epoch of the fire mist had ebbed from the earth, these spirits found within man an opportunity to resume their activity connected with the sun. It now becomes clear whence the name Lucifer, that is, the bearer of light, originates, and why these beings are designated as sun gods in mystery science. All that follows can only be understood if one looks back to periods preceding the development of the earth. This will be done in the next chapters of the Akasha Chronicle. The development through which the beings connected with earth passed on other planets before appearing on the earth will be shown there. In addition, one will become more fully acquainted with the nature of the moon gods and of the sun gods. Simultaneously, the development of the animal, plant, and mineral realms will become entirely clear. 11. Some necessary points of view. We shall next consider the development of man and of the entities connected with him in the time which preceded the earthly period. For when man began to unite his destiny with the planet one calls Earth, he had already passed through a series of developmental steps in the course of which he had prepared himself for earthly existence, as it were. One must distinguish three such steps, which are designated as three planetary developmental stages. The names used in mystery science for these stages are the Saturn, Sun, and Moon periods. It will become apparent that these designations at first have nothing to do with the heavenly bodies of today, which bear these names in physical astronomy, although in a broader sense a relationship to them exists, which is known to the advanced mystic. One will sometimes say that man inhabited other planets before he appeared on Earth, but under these other planets one must only understand earlier developmental conditions of the Earth itself and of its inhabitants. Before it became Earth, the Earth with all the beings which belong to it passed through the three conditions of the Saturn, Sun, and Moon existence. Saturn, Sun, and Moon are, as it were, the three incarnations of the Earth in primeval times. What in this connection is called Saturn, Sun, and Moon no more exists today as a physical planet than the previous physical incarnations of a human being continue to exist alongside his present one. This planetary development of man and of the other beings belonging to Earth will form the subject of the following discussions from the Akasha Chronicle. By this, we do not wish to say that the three conditions named were not preceded by others, but everything which precedes these three is lost in a darkness which for the present the research of mystery science cannot illuminate. For this research is not based on speculation, on a daydreaming in terms of mere concepts, but on actual spiritual experience. As our physical eye can see outdoors only as far as a certain boundary line and cannot look beyond the horizon, so the spiritual eye can look only as far as a certain point in time. Mystery science is based on experience and is content to remain within this experience. Only in a conceptual splitting of hairs will one want to find out what was at the very beginning of the world, or why God really created the world. For the scientist of the spirit, it is rather a matter of realizing that at a certain stage of cognition, one no longer poses such questions. Everything man needs for the fulfillment of his destiny on our planet is revealed to him within spiritual experience. The one who patiently works his way into the experiences of scientists of the spirit will see that within spiritual experience man can obtain full satisfaction concerning all those questions which are vital to him. In the following essays, for example, one will see how completely the question concerning the origin of evil is resolved, as well as much else which man must desire to know. We by no means intend to imply that man can never receive enlightenment concerning questions about the origin of the world and similar matters. He can, but in order to be able to be enlightened, he must first absorb the knowledge revealed within more proximate spiritual experience. He then comes to realize that he must ask these questions in a different manner than heretofore. The more deeply one works his way into true mystery science, the more modest he becomes. Only then does he realize how one must very gradually make oneself ready and worthy for certain insight. Pride and arrogance finally become names for human qualities which no longer make sense at a certain level of cognition. When one has understood a little, he sees how immeasurably long is the road which lies ahead of him. Through knowledge one gains insight into how little one knows. He also acquires a feeling for the immense responsibility he assumes when he speaks of supersensible cognition. But mankind cannot live without the latter. However, he who promulgates such knowledge needs modesty and true self-criticism, an unshakable striving for self-knowledge, and the utmost caution. Such remarks are necessary here, since now the ascent toward even higher knowledge than is to be found in the preceding sections of the Akasha Chronicle is to be undertaken. To the vistas which in the following essays will be opened toward the past of man, others will be added upon the future. For the future can be revealed to true spiritual cognition, if only to the extent to which this is necessary for man in order that he can fulfill his destiny. The one who will have nothing to do with mystery science, and from the judgment seat of his prejudices, simply consigns everything coming from that quarter to the realm of fantasy and dreams. He will understand this relationship to the future least of all. Yet a simple logical consideration could make clear what is in question here. But such logical considerations are accepted only when they coincide with the preconceptions of men. Prejudices are mighty enemies of logic. If sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen are brought together under certain definite conditions, sulfuric acid must be produced according to an inevitable law. The student of chemistry can predict what must happen when these three elements come into contact with one another under given conditions. Thus, such a student of chemistry is a prophet in the limited field of the material world. His prophecy could only prove false if the laws of nature were suddenly to change. Now the scientist of the spirit investigates spiritual laws in just the manner in which the physicist or the chemist investigates material laws. He does this in the manner and with the exactness which are requisite in the spiritual field. However, the development of mankind depends on these great spiritual laws. Just as little as oxygen, hydrogen, and sulfur will combine at some future time in a manner contrary to laws of nature, so little will anything occur in the spiritual life which is contrary to spiritual laws. The one who knows these spiritual laws can look into the orderliness of the future. The use of precisely this comparison for the prophetic prediction of the coming destinies of mankind is intentional here, because true mystery science really understands this prediction in just this sense. For the one who forms a clear idea of this conviction of occultism, the objection that any human freedom is made impossible because events can be predicted in a certain sense becomes void. That can be predicted which is in accordance with a law. But the will is not determined by a law, just as it is certain that in each case oxygen, hydrogen, and sulfur are combined into sulfuric acid only according to a definite law, just so is it equally certain that the establishing of the conditions under which the law will act can depend on the human will. Thus it will be with the great world events and human destinies of the future. As a scientist of the spirit, one foresees them, although they are to be brought about only by human choice. He foresees what is accomplished by the freedom of man. The following essays will show that this is possible. However, one must be clear about one essential difference between the prediction of events through physical science and that through spiritual cognition. Physical science is based on the insights of the understanding, and therefore its prophecy is only based on the intellect, which has to rely on judgments, deductions, combinations, and so forth. Prophecy through spiritual cognition, on the contrary, proceeds from an actual higher seeing or perceiving. The scientist of the spirit must strictly avoid even representing anything to himself which is based on mere reflecting, combining, speculating, and so forth. Here he must practice the most far-reaching renunciation and be quite clear that all speculating, intellectual philosophizing, and so forth is a hindrance to true seeing. These activities still belong entirely to the lower nature of man, and truly higher cognition begins only when this nature raises itself to the higher nature in man. Here nothing is really said against these activities, which are not only wholly justified in their field, but are there the only justified ones. In itself, a thing is neither higher nor lower. It is higher or lower only in relation to something else. What is high in one respect can be very low in another. However, what must be understood through seeing cannot be understood through mere reflection or through even the most magnificent combinations of the intellect. A person may be ever so ingenious in the usual sense of the word, but this ingenuity will avail him absolutely nothing with respect to the cognition of supersensible truths. He must even renounce it and abandon himself solely to the higher seeing. Then he will perceive things without his ingenious reflecting, just as he perceives the flowers in the fields without further reflection. It does not help one to reflect about the appearance of a meadow. All intellect is powerless there. The same is true of the seeing into higher worlds. What can be said prophetically in this way about the future of man is the basis for all ideals which have a real, practical significance. If they are to have value, ideals must be rooted as deeply in the spiritual world as are natural laws in the natural world. Laws of development must be such true ideals. Otherwise they spring from a gushing enthusiasm and a fantasy which are valueless and can never be fulfilled. In the broadest sense, all great ideals of world history have proceeded from clear cognition. For in the final analysis, all these great ideals originate with the great scientists of the spirit or initiates, and those lesser ones who collaborate in the development of humanity direct themselves either consciously or most often unconsciously in accordance with the instructions of the spiritual scientists. Everything unconscious must finally have its origin in something conscious. The bricklayer who works on a house unconsciously directs himself according to matters of which others are conscious, who have determined the place where the house is to be built, the style in which it is to be erected, and so forth. But this determining of place and style is based on something of which the determiners remain unconscious, but of which others are or were conscious. An artist, for example, knows why a particular style requires a straight line here, a curved line there, and so forth. The one who uses this style for his house perhaps does not become conscious of this why. This is also the case with the great events in the development of the world and of mankind. Behind those who work in a certain field stand higher, more conscious workers, and thus the scale of consciousness goes up and down. Behind the general mass of men stand the inventors, artists, scientists, and so forth. Behind them stand the initiates of mystery science, and behind them stand superhuman beings. the development of the world and of mankind becomes comprehensible only if one realizes that ordinary human consciousness is but one form of consciousness, and that there are higher and lower forms. But here, too, one must not misapply the expressions higher and lower. They have a significance only in relation to the point where one happens to be standing. It is no different with this than with right and left. When one stands at a certain place, some objects are right or left of him. If one moves a little to the right, objects which before were on the right are now on the left. The same is true of the levels of consciousness which lie higher or lower than ordinary human consciousness. When man himself develops more highly, his relations to the other levels of consciousness change, but these changes are connected with his development. It is therefore important to indicate such other levels of consciousness here by means of examples. The beehive, or that magnificent commonwealth embodied in an anthill, provides basis for such an indication. The collaboration of the various kinds of insects, females, males, workers, proceeds in a completely systematic fashion. The distribution of tasks among the several categories can only be described as an expression of true wisdom. What happens here is just as much the result of a consciousness as the institutions of man in the physical world. Technology, art, state, and so forth are an effect of his consciousness. However, the consciousness at the base of the beehive or the ant society is not to be found in the same physical world in which the ordinary human consciousness exists. In order to describe the situation, one can express oneself somewhat as follows. One finds man in the physical world. His physical organs, his whole structure, are such that at first one looks for his consciousness also in this physical world. It is otherwise with the beehive or the anthill. Here, it would be quite wrong to confine oneself to the physical world with respect to the consciousness in question, as was done in the case of man. No, here one must say that to find the ordering principle of the beehive or the anthill, one cannot confine oneself to the world where the bees or ants live in their physical bodies. In this case, the conscious mind must be sought directly in another world. The same conscious mind which in man lives in the physical world, in the case of these animal colonies, must be sought in a supersensible world. If with his consciousness man could raise himself into this supersensible world, he would be able to greet the ant or bee spirit there in full consciousness as his sister being. The seer can actually do this. Thus, in the examples given above, we are confronted by beings which are conscious in other worlds and which reach into the physical world only through their physical organs, the individual bees and ants. It is quite possible that a consciousness like that of the beehive or of the anthill existed in the physical world in earlier periods of its development, as that of man does now, but then raised itself and left behind in the physical world only its acting organs, that is, the individual ants and bees. Such a course of development will actually take place in the future with respect to man. In a certain manner, it has already taken place among the seers in the present. That the consciousness of contemporary man functions in the physical world is due to the fact that its physical particles, the molecules of brain and nerves, exist in a quite definite relation with one another. What has been discussed in greater detail in another connection in my book, Wie erlangt man Erkenntnisse der höheren Welten? How does one attain knowledge of higher worlds? Will also be indicated briefly here. In the course of the higher development of man, the ordinary connection of the brain molecules is dissolved. They are then connected more loosely, so that the brain of a seer can really be compared with an anthill in a certain respect, although the segmentation is not demonstrable anatomically. In different activities of the world, these processes occur in quite different ways. At a time long past, the individual molecules of the anthill, that is, the ants themselves, were firmly connected, just as are the molecules of the human brain today. At that time, the consciousness corresponding to them was in the physical world, as that of man is today. When human consciousness will travel into higher worlds in the future, the connection between the material parts in the physical world will be as loose as is that between the individual ants today. What in time will occur physically in all men already takes place today in the brain of the clairvoyant, but no instrument of the world of the senses is sufficiently delicate to show the loosening which comes about through this anticipatory development. Just as among the bees 3 categories, queens, drones, workers, are formed, so 3 categories of molecules are formed in the seer brain, molecules which are actually individual, living beings brought into conscious collaboration by the consciousness of the seer, which is in a higher world. Another level of consciousness is represented by what one usually calls the folk or racial spirit, without representing anything very definite to oneself by this. For the scientist of the spirit, a consciousness also exists at the base of the common and wise influences which appear in the communal life of the members of a people or of a race. Through occult research, one finds this consciousness to be in another world, just as was the case with the consciousness of a beehive or of an anthill. However, there are no organs for this folk or racial consciousness in the physical world. Rather, these organs are to be found only in the so-called astral world. As the consciousness of the beehive works through the physical bees, so the folk consciousness works by means of the astral bodies of the human beings belonging to a people. In these folk and racial spirits, one is therefore confronted with kinds of entities quite different from those in man or in the beehive. Many more examples would have to be given in order to show clearly how subordinate and superior entities exist in relation to man. But it is hoped that what has been given will be sufficient to introduce the avenues of human development described in the following chapters, for the development of man himself can only be understood when one considers that he develops together with beings whose consciousness exists in other worlds than his own. What happens in his world is also dependent on these beings who are connected with other levels of consciousness, and therefore can be understood only in relation to this fact. 12. On the origin of the earth. As individual man has to pass through different stages after his birth, as he must ascend from infancy through childhood and so on to the age of the mature adult, so too must mankind as a whole go through a similar process. Humanity has developed to its present condition by passing through other stages. With the methods of the clairvoyant, one can discern 3 principal stages of this development of mankind, which were passed through before the formation of the earth took place, and before this sphere became the scene of that development. Therefore, at present, we are concerned with the 4th stage in the great universal life of man. For now, we shall relate the relevant facts here. The deeper explanation will appear in the course of the description, insofar as is possible in the words of ordinary language, that is, without having recourse to the form of expression of mystery science. Man existed before there was an earth, but one must not imagine, as has already been suggested, that perhaps he had previously lived on other planets and then at a certain time migrated to earth. Rather, the earth has developed together with man. Just as man has passed through 3 main stages of development, so has the earth before becoming that which one now calls earth. For the time being, as has been indicated above, one must completely liberate oneself from the significance which contemporary science connects with the names Saturn, Sun, and Moon, if one wants to see the explanations of the scientist of the spirit in this area in their proper light. For the present, one should connect with these names no other significance than that directly given to them in the following communications. Before the heavenly body on which the life of man takes place became earth, it had had 3 other forms, which one designates as Saturn, Sun, and Moon. One can thus speak of 4 planets on which the 4 principal stages of the development of mankind take place. It is so that before the earth became earth, it was Moon, before that Sun, and yet earlier, Saturn. One is justified, as will appear from the following communications, to assume 3 further principal stages which the earth, or better the heavenly body which developed into the present earth, still has to pass through. In mystery science, these have been named Jupiter, Venus, and Vulcan. Thus, the heavenly body with which human destiny is connected has passed through 3 stages in the past, is now in its 4th, and will in the future have to pass through 3 more until all the talents which man has within himself are developed, until he arrives at the peak of his perfection. One must realize that the development of man and of his heavenly body does not proceed as gradually as, for instance, the passage of an individual human being through infancy, adolescence, and so forth, where one condition goes over into another more or less imperceptibly. Rather, there are certain interruptions. The Saturn condition does not go over immediately into the Sun stage. Between Saturn development and Sun development, and similarly between the subsequent forms of the heavenly body inhabited by man, there are intermediate conditions which can be compared with the night between 2 days, or with the sleep-like condition of a plant seed before it again develops into a full plant. In imitation of Oriental descriptions of this state of affairs, contemporary theosophy calls a stage of development in which life is externally furthered, Manvantara, the intermediate condition of rest, Pralaya. In accordance with the usage of European mystery science, one can use the word open cycle for the former condition, and on the other hand, hidden or closed cycle for the latter. But other designations are also in common use. Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, and so forth are open cycles, and the periods of rest between them are closed ones. It would be quite erroneous to think that in the periods of rest all life is extinct, although today this idea can be encountered in many theosophical circles. Just as little as man ceases to live during his sleep, so little does his life and that of his heavenly body become extinct during a closed cycle, Pralaya. It is only that the conditions of life in the periods of rest cannot be perceived with the senses which have been developed during the open cycles, just as during his sleep man does not perceive what is taking place around him. Why one uses the expression cycle for the stages of development will become sufficiently clear in the course of the following discussion. Only later can we speak about the enormous periods of time which are required for these cycles. One can find a thread through the course of the cycles by following for a moment the development of human consciousness through them. Everything else can suitably arise out of this consideration of consciousness. The consciousness which man develops during his life course on earth will be called, in accordance with European mystery science, the clear consciousness of day. The latter consists in the fact that through his present senses, man perceives the things and beings of the world, and that he forms conceptions and ideas concerning these things and beings with the help of his understanding and of his reason. He then acts in the world of the senses according to these perceptions, conceptions, and ideas. Man formed this consciousness only in the 4th principal stage of his cosmic development. On Saturn, Sun, and Moon, it did not yet exist. There he lived in other conditions of consciousness. As a result, one can describe the 3 previous stages of development as the unfolding of lower conditions of consciousness. The lowest condition of consciousness was passed through during the Saturn development. The sun condition is higher, then follows the moon consciousness, and finally that of earth. These former consciousnesses are primarily distinguished from the earthly one by two characteristics: by the degree of clarity and by the area over which the perception of man extends. The Saturn consciousness has the lowest degree of clarity. It is entirely dull. It is difficult to give an exact idea of this dullness, since even the dullness of sleep is somewhat clearer than this consciousness. In abnormal, so-called deep states of trance, modern man can still fall back into this state of consciousness. The clairvoyant, in the sense of mystery science, can also form a correct conception of it, but by no means does he himself live in this state of consciousness. On the contrary, he ascends to a much higher one, which, however, in certain respects, is similar to the original one. In the ordinary man at the contemporary terrestrial stage, this condition, through which he once passed, has been effaced by the clear consciousness of day. The medium, who falls into a deep trance, however, is transported back into it, so that he perceives in the same way in which all men perceived during the Saturn period. Either during the trance or after awaking, such a medium can then tell of experiences which are similar to those of the Saturn stage. One must be careful to say that they are similar, not identical, for the events which took place on Saturn are once and for all past. Only events which have a certain affinity with them still take place in the environment of man. These can only be perceived by a Saturn consciousness. Like the medium, the clairvoyant in the above sense acquires such a Saturn consciousness, but in addition to it, he keeps his clear consciousness of day, which man did not yet have on Saturn, and which the medium loses in the state of trance. Such a clairvoyant is not in the Saturn consciousness itself, but he can form a conception of it. While this Saturn consciousness is by some degrees inferior to the one of today with respect to clarity, it is superior to the latter with respect to the extent of what it can perceive. In its dullness, it cannot only perceive everything which takes place on its own heavenly body, down to the last detail, but it can also observe the objects and beings on other heavenly bodies which are connected with Saturn. It can also exercise a certain influence on these objects and beings. It hardly need be said that this observation of other heavenly bodies is quite different from that which contemporary man can undertake by means of his scientific astronomy. This astronomical observation is based on the clear consciousness of day, and therefore perceives other heavenly bodies from the outside. The Saturn consciousness, on the other hand, is immediate sensation, an experiencing of what takes place on other heavenly bodies. One does not speak altogether accurately, but still fairly so, if one says that an inhabitant of Saturn experienced objects and events of other heavenly bodies, and of his own, as a man of today experiences his heart and his heartbeat, or something similar in his own body. This Saturn consciousness develops slowly. As the first principal stage in the development of mankind, it passed through a series of subordinate stages, which in European mystery science are called small cycles. In theosophical literature, it has become customary to call these small cycles rounds, and their further subdivisions, still smaller cycles, globes. These subordinate cycles will be dealt with in subsequent discussions. For the sake of greater clarity, we shall first follow here the principal stages of development. For the moment, we shall speak only of man, although the development of subordinate and superior entities and objects proceeds concurrently with his own. That which concerns the development of other entities will then follow the discussion of man's progress. When the development of the Saturn consciousness was completed, there occurred one of the long rest periods, a pralaya, mentioned above. After this, there developed out of the heavenly body of man what in mystery science is called the sun. On the sun, the human beings again emerged from their sleep. The previously developed Saturn consciousness was present in them as a predisposition. First, they again developed it from this germ. One can say that on the sun, man repeated the condition of Saturn before ascending to a higher one. However, it is not a simple repetition which is meant here, but one in another form. These transformations of forms will be discussed later when we deal with the smaller cycles. At that time, the differences between the individual repetitions will also become apparent. Now we shall describe only the development of consciousness. After the repetition of the Saturn condition, the sun consciousness of man appears. This is somewhat clearer than the preceding consciousness, but on the other hand, it has lost something with respect to broadness of vision. In the deep, dreamless sleep of his present life, man has a condition of consciousness similar to that which he once had on the sun. However, he who is not a clairvoyant or a medium cannot perceive the objects and beings corresponding to the sun consciousness. With the trance of a medium reduced to this condition, and with the higher consciousness of the true clairvoyant, the case here is similar to what has been said with respect to the Saturn consciousness. The extent of the sun consciousness is limited to the sun and the heavenly bodies most closely connected with it. It is only these and their events which the inhabitant of the sun can experience as, to use once again the simile employed above, man of today experiences his heartbeat. In this way, the inhabitant of Saturn could also participate in the life of those heavenly bodies which did not belong to the immediate sphere of Saturn. When the sun stage has passed through the appropriate subordinate cycles, it also enters a period of rest. From this, the heavenly body of man awakes to its moon existence. Before ascending higher, again man passes through the Saturn and sun stage in two smaller cycles. Then he enters his moon consciousness. One can more easily form an idea of the latter, for there is a certain similarity between this stage of consciousness and a sleep filled with dreams. It must be explicitly stated that here again one can only speak of a similarity, not of an identity. It is true that the moon consciousness is composed of images such as appear in dreams, but these images correspond to the objects and events around man in a way similar to the ideas of the present clear consciousness of day. But everything in this correspondence is still dull, in fact, image-like. One can represent this state of affairs to oneself in approximately the following way. Assume that a moon being comes near an object, let us say near salt. Of course, at that time, there was no salt in its present form, but after all, in order to be understood, one must remain in the area of images and similes. This moon being, the precursor of present-day man, does not perceive an object with spatial extension and a definite coloring and form outside itself. Instead, the approach to this object causes a certain image, similar to a dream image, to arise as it were within his being. This image has a certain coloring which depends on the characteristics of the object. If the object is agreeable to the being and useful for its existence, the coloring is light in yellow nuances or in green. If the object is disagreeable or is one which is harmful to the being, a blood-like reddish color nuance appears. The clairvoyant also sees in this way today, only he is fully conscious during this seeing, while the moon inhabitant had only a dreamlike, dim consciousness. The images appearing within these inhabitants had an exactly defined relationship to the environment. There was nothing arbitrary in them. It was possible to direct oneself by them. One acted under the impression of these images as today one acts under the impression of sensory perceptions. The development of this dreamlike consciousness, the third principal stage, was the task of the moon cycle. When the moon had passed through the appropriate small cycles, a period of rest, pralaya, again occurred. After this, the earth emerged from the darkness. 13. The Earth and its future. The fourth principal stage of human development is lived on Earth. This is that condition of consciousness in which man finds himself at present. But before he attained it, he, and with him the whole Earth, first had to repeat successively the Saturn, Sun, and Moon stages in 3 smaller cycles, the so-called rounds of theosophical literature. Man now lives in the 4th Earth cycle. He has already advanced a little past the middle of this cycle. At this stage of consciousness, man no longer perceives in a dreamlike manner the images which arise in his soul through the influence of his environment only, but objects appear to him outside in space. On the moon, and also during the stages of repetition on Earth, there arose, for example, a colored image in his soul when a particular object came near him. All of consciousness consisted of such images, tones, and so forth, which flowed and ebbed in the soul. Only with the appearance of the 4th condition of consciousness does color no longer appear merely in the soul, but on an external, spatially circumscribed object. Sound is no longer merely an inner reverberating of the soul, but the resounding of an object in space. In mystery science, therefore, one also calls this 4th, the earthly condition of consciousness, the objective consciousness. It has been formed slowly and gradually in the course of development, in the way that the physical organs of sense slowly arose and thus made perceptible the most diverse sensory qualities in external objects. Apart from the senses which are already developed, others exist in an as yet germinal state which will become fully developed in the subsequent Earth period, and which will show the world of the senses in a diversity still greater than is the case today. The gradual growth of this Earth consciousness has been described in the preceding pages, and in the discussions which are to follow this description will be amplified and supplemented in essential points. The colored world, the sounding world, and so forth, which earlier man had perceived within himself, confronts him outside in space during his life on Earth, but on the other hand a new world appears within him, the world of ideas or thoughts. One cannot speak of ideas and thoughts in relation to the moon consciousness. The latter consists solely of the images we have described. Around the middle of the development of Earth, although this state of affairs was already preparing itself at a somewhat earlier time, there developed in man the capacity to form ideas and thoughts about objects. This capacity constitutes the basis for memory and for self-consciousness. Only conceptualizing man can develop a memory of that which he has perceived, and only thinking man reaches the point where he differentiates himself from his environment as an independent, self-conscious being, where he recognizes himself as an I. The first 3 stages we have described were stages of consciousness. The 4th is not only consciousness, but self-consciousness. But within the self-consciousness, the present-day life of thoughts, there is already developing a disposition towards still higher states of consciousness. Man will live through these states of consciousness on the next planets into which the Earth will change after its present form. It is not absurd to say something about these future conditions of consciousness, and therewith about life on the following planets. For in the first place, the clairvoyant, for certain reasons which are to be given elsewhere, strides ahead of his fellows in his development. Thus those states of consciousness which all of mankind must attain with the advance of planetary development are already developing in him at this time. In the consciousness of the clairvoyant, one finds an image of the future stages of mankind. Moreover, the 3 subsequent conditions of consciousness are now already present in all men in germinal states, and clairvoyant research has means for indicating what will emerge from these germinal states. When it is said that the clairvoyant is already developing in himself the states of consciousness to which in future all of mankind will advance, this must be understood with one restriction. The clairvoyant, for example, is developing a seeing in the spiritual world today, which in future will appear in man in a physical way. But this future physical condition of man will be a faithful likeness of the corresponding contemporary spiritual one in the clairvoyant. The earth itself is going to develop, and therefore quite different forms from those which exist today will appear in its future physical inhabitants. But these physical forms are being prepared in the spiritual and mental ones of today. For example, what the clairvoyant today sees in the form of a cloud of light and color around the human physical body as a so-called aura will later change into a physical form, and other organs of sense than those of today will give the man of the future the capacity to perceive other forms. However, already today, the clairvoyant sees the spiritual models of the later material entities with his spiritual senses. Thus, for example, the aura. A view into the future is possible for him, although it is very difficult to give an idea of the character of this view through the language of today and for present-day human conceptions. The conceptions of the present state of consciousness are shadowy and pale in comparison with the colorful and sounding objects of the external world. Man therefore speaks of conceptions as of something which is not real. A mere thought is contrasted with an object or a being which is real because it can be perceived through the senses. But the conceptions and thoughts bear within themselves the potentiality of again becoming real and image-like. If man speaks of the conception red today, without having a red object before him, then this conception is, as it were, only a shadow image of real redness. Later, man will reach the point where he can not only let the shadowy conception of the red arise in his soul, but where, when he thinks red, red will actually be before him. He will be able to create images, not merely conceptions. Thereby something will be achieved by him similar to that which already existed for the moon consciousness. But the images will not ebb and flow in him like dreams. Instead, he will evoke them in full self-consciousness, as he does today's conceptions. The thought of a color will be the color itself, the conception of a sound will be the sound itself, and so forth. In the future, a world of images will flow and ebb in the soul of man through his own power, whereas during the moon existence, such a world of images filled him without his acting. In the meantime, the spatial character of the objective external world will not disappear. The color which arises together with the conception of color will not be merely an image in the soul, but will appear in outside space. The consequence of this will be that man will be able to perceive beings and objects of a higher kind than those of his present environment. These are objects and beings which are of a more delicate spiritual and soul nature. Hence they do not clothe themselves in the objective colors which are perceptible to the present physical sense organs. However, these are objects and beings which will reveal themselves through the more delicate spiritual and mental colors and sounds which the man of the future will be able to create from his soul. Man is approaching a condition in which he will have a self-conscious image consciousness appropriate for such perceptions. On the one hand, the coming development of earth will raise the present life of conceptions and thoughts to an ever higher, more delicate, and more perfect condition. On the other hand, the self-conscious image consciousness will gradually develop itself during this time. The latter, however, will attain full life in man only on the next planet into which the earth will transform itself, and which is called Jupiter in mystery science. Then man will be able to enter into intercourse with beings which are completely hidden from his present sensory perception. It will be understood that not only does the life of perception thereby become totally different, but that actions, feelings, and all relations to the environment are completely transformed. While today man can consciously influence only sensory beings, he will then be able to act consciously on very different forces and powers. He himself will receive what to him will be fully recognizable influences from very different realms than at present. At that stage, there can no longer be any question of birth and death in the present sense, for death occurs only because the consciousness has to depend on an external world with which it enters into communication through the physical sense organs. When these physical sense organs fail, every relation to the environment ceases. That is to say, the man has died. However, when his soul is so far advanced that it does not receive the influences of the outside world through physical instruments, but receives them through the images which the soul creates out of itself, then it will have reached the point where it can regulate its intercourse with the environment independently. That is, its life will not be interrupted against its will. It has become lord over birth and death. All this will come to be with the developed self-conscious image consciousness on Jupiter. This state of the soul is also called the psychic consciousness. The next condition of consciousness to which man develops on a further planet, Venus, is distinguished from the previous one by the fact that the soul can now create not only images, but also objects and beings. This occurs in the self-conscious object consciousness or suprapsychic consciousness. Through the image consciousness, man can perceive something of supersensible beings and objects, and he can influence them through the awakening of his image conceptions. But in order for that to take place which he desires of such a supersensible being at his instigation, this being must use its own forces. Thus man is the ruler over images, and he can produce effects through these images, but he is not yet lord over the forces themselves. When his self-conscious object consciousness is developed, he will also be ruler over the creative forces of other worlds. He will not only perceive and influence beings, but he himself will create. This is the course of the development of consciousness. At first it begins dimly. One perceives nothing of other objects and beings, but only the inner experiences, images of one's own soul. Then perception is developed. At last, the perceptive consciousness is transformed into a creative one. Before the condition of Earth goes over into the life of Jupiter, after the fourth earthly cycle, there are 3 more smaller cycles to be passed through. These serve for the further perfection of the consciousness of Earth in a manner to be described in the following essays, when the development of the smaller cycles and of their subdivisions will be described for all 7 planets. When, after a period of rest, pralaya, Earth has changed into Jupiter, and when man has arrived on the latter planet, then the 4 preceding conditions, Saturn, Sun, Moon, and Earth condition, must again be repeated during 4 smaller cycles, and only during the 5th cycle of Jupiter does man attain the stage which has been described above as the real Jupiter consciousness. In a corresponding manner does the Venus consciousness appear during the 6th cycle of Venus. A fact which will play a certain role in the following essays will be briefly indicated here. This concerns the speed with which the development on the different planets takes place, for this is not the same on all the planets. Life proceeds with the greatest speed on Saturn. The rapidity then decreases on the Sun, becomes still less on the Moon, and reaches its slowest phase on the Earth. On the latter it becomes slower and slower, to the point at which self-consciousness develops. Then the speed increases again. Therefore, today man has already passed the time of the greatest slowness of his development. Life has begun to accelerate again. On Jupiter the speed of the Moon, on Venus that of the Sun will again be attained. The last planet which can still be counted among the series of earthly transformations, and hence follows Venus, is called Vulcan, by Mystery Science. On this planet, the provisional goal of the development of mankind is attained. The condition of consciousness into which man enters there is called piety, or spiritual consciousness. Man will attain it in the 7th cycle of Vulcan after a repetition of the 6 preceding stages. Not much can be publicly communicated about the life on this planet. In mystery science, one speaks of it in such a way that it is said, no soul, which with its thinking is still tied to a physical body, should reflect about Vulcan and its life. That is, only the mystery students of the higher order, who may leave their physical body and can acquire supersensible knowledge outside of it, can learn something about Vulcan. The 7 stages of consciousness are thus expressed in the course of the development of mankind in 7 planetary developments. At each stage, the consciousness must now pass through 7 subordinate conditions. These are realized in the smaller cycles already mentioned. In theosophical writings, these 7 cycles are called rounds. These subordinate states are called conditions of life by the mystery science of the Occident, in contrast with the superordinated conditions of consciousness. Or one says that each condition of consciousness moves through 7 realms. According to this calculation, one must distinguish 7 times 7 in the whole development of mankind, that is, 49 small cycles or realms, according to common theosophical usage, rounds, and again, each small cycle has to pass through 7 yet smaller ones, which are called conditions of form, in theosophical language, globes. For the full cycle of humanity, this amounts to 7 times 49, or 343 different conditions of form. The following discussions, which deal with this development, will show that a survey of the whole is not as complicated as might appear at the mention of the number 343. It will become apparent how man can only truly understand himself when he knows his own development. 14. The life of Saturn. In one of the preceding descriptions, the great development of humanity through the 7 stages of consciousness, from Saturn to Vulcan, has been compared with the progress through life between birth and death, through infancy, childhood, and so on, to old age. One can extend this comparison further, as among contemporary humanity, men of different ages do not only follow upon one another, but also exist side by side. So it is with the development of the stages of consciousness. The aged man, the mature man, or the mature woman, the youth, travel through life side by side. Thus the ancestors of man existed on Saturn, not only as beings with the dull Saturn consciousness, but also along with these as beings which had already developed the higher stages of consciousness. When the Saturn development began, there already existed natures with sun consciousness, others with image consciousness, moon consciousness, those with a consciousness similar to the present consciousness of man, then a 4th kind with self-conscious psychic image consciousness, a 5th with self-conscious suprapsychic object consciousness, and a 6th with creative spiritual consciousness. This does not exhaust the series of beings. After the Vulcan stage, man will develop yet further, and will ascend to still higher levels of consciousness. As the external eye looks into misty gray distances, so the inner eye of the seer looks upon 5 more forms of consciousness, as far off as distant spirits, of which a description, however, is quite impossible. In all, one can speak of 12 stages of consciousness. The Saturn man was surrounded by 11 other kinds of beings. The 4 highest had had their tasks on levels of development which preceded the life of Saturn. When this life began, they had already arrived at such a high stage of development that their further existence took place in worlds that lie beyond the realms of man. Therefore we cannot and need not speak of them here. The other kinds of beings, however, 7 of them in addition to the Saturn man, are all concerned in the human development. In this they act as creative powers, performing their services in a way which will be described in the following pages. When the Saturn development began, the most sublime of these beings already had attained a level of consciousness which man will reach only after his Vulcan life, that is, a high creative, supra-spiritual consciousness. These creators, too, once had to pass through the stages of man. This took place on heavenly bodies which preceded Saturn. However, The connection of these beings with the development of mankind lasted until the middle of the life of Saturn. Because of their sublime, delicate body of rays, in mystery science they are called radiating lives or radiating flames. Because the substance of which this body consisted had a remote resemblance to the will of man, they are also called spirits of will. These spirits are the creators of the man of Saturn. From their bodies they pour the substance which becomes the carrier of the human Saturn consciousness. The period of development during which this takes place is called the first small Saturn cycle. In the language of theosophy, this is the first round. The material body which man receives in this way is the first rudiment of his later physical body. One can say that the germ of the physical human body is planted during the first Saturn cycle by the spirits of will, and that at that time this germ has the dull Saturn consciousness. This first smaller Saturn cycle is followed by 6 others. In the course of these cycles, man does not attain a higher degree of consciousness, but the material body which he has received is further elaborated. The other kinds of beings indicated above participate in this elaboration in the most diverse ways. After the spirits of will, there follow beings with a creative, spiritual consciousness, similar to that which man will attain on Vulcan. They are called spirits of wisdom. Christian mystery science calls them dominions, Kuriotetes, while it calls the spirits of will thrones. During the second cycle of Saturn, they advance their own development to some extent, and at the same time work on the human body in such a way that a wise arrangement, a rational structure, is implanted in it. To be more exact, their work on man already begins shortly after the middle of the first cycle, and is completed in about the middle of the second. The third kind of spirits with the self-conscious, supra-psychic object consciousness is called spirits of motion or of activity. In Christian mystery science they are called principalities, dunamis. In theosophical literature, the expression mahat is to be found for them. From the middle of the second Saturn cycle onward, they combine with the progress of their own development, the further elaboration of the human material body, in which they implant the capacity of movement and of forceful activity. This task comes to a conclusion around the middle of the third Saturn cycle. After this point, the work of the fourth kind of beings, the so-called spirits of form, begins. They have a self-conscious image consciousness, psychic consciousness. Christian esoteric teaching names them powers, exousiae. Through their work, the human material body, which previously was a kind of mobile cloud, receives a bounded plastic form. This activity of the spirits of form is completed around the middle of the fourth Saturn cycle. Then follows the activity of the spirits of darkness, which are also called spirits of personality or of selfhood, egoism. At this stage, they have a consciousness similar to the present human earthly consciousness. They inhabit the formed human material body as souls in a way similar to that in which the human soul inhabits its body today. They implant a kind of sensory organ in the body, which are the germs of the sensory organs which later develop in the human body in the course of the development of Earth. One must realize, however, that these sensory germs are still substantially different from the present sensory instruments of man. Earth man could not perceive through such sensory germs. For him, the images of the sensory instruments must first pass through a more refined ether body, which forms on the sun, and through an astral body, which owes its existence to the moon development. All this will become clear in the following chapters. But the spirits of personality can treat the images of the sensory germs through their own soul in such a way that with their aid they can perceive external objects, as does man during his earthly development. In their work on the human body, the spirits of personality pass through their own stage of humanity. Thus they are men from the middle of the fourth to the middle of the fifth Saturn cycle. These spirits implant selfhood, egoism in the body of man. Since they only attain their stage of humanity on Saturn, they remain connected with the development of mankind for a long time. Thus they have important work to perform on man in subsequent cycles as well. This work always acts as an inoculation with selfhood. The degenerations of selfhood into selfishness must be ascribed to their activity, while on the other hand they are the originators of all of man's independence. Without them, man would never have become a self-enclosed entity, a personality. Christian esoteric teaching uses the expression primal beginnings, archai, for them, and in theosophical literature they are designated as asuras. The work of these spirits is succeeded around the middle of the fifth Saturn cycle by that of the sons of fire, who at this stage still have a dull image consciousness similar to the moon consciousness of man. They attain the stage of humanity only on the next planet, the sun. Their work here is therefore to a certain degree still unconscious and dreamlike, but it is through them that the activity of the sensory germs from the previous cycle is enlivened. The light images produced by the fire spirits shine outward through these sensory germs. The ancestor of man is thereby elevated to a kind of shining entity. While the life of Saturn is otherwise dark, man now shines in the general darkness. The spirits of personality, on the other hand, were still awakened to their human existence in this general darkness. The human being himself can make no use of his luminosity on Saturn. The luminosity of his sensory germs could not express anything in itself, but through it other more exalted beings are given the possibility to reveal themselves to the life of Saturn. Through the sources of light of the ancestors of man, these beings radiate something of their nature down to the planet. These are exalted beings from among those four ranks of which it has been said above that they have grown beyond all connection with human existence in their development. Without any necessity for them to do it, they now radiate something of their nature out of free will. Christian esoteric teaching here speaks of the revelation of the seraphim, the spirits of love. This condition lasts until the middle of the sixth Saturn cycle. After this begins the work of those beings which at this stage have a dull consciousness, such as is found in man today when he is in a deep, dreamless sleep. These beings are the sons of twilight, the spirits of dusk. In theosophical writings they are called lunar pitris or barhishad pitris. They attain the stage of humanity only on the moon. On earth they, as well as their predecessors, the sons of fire, have already grown beyond the stage of humanity. On earth they are higher beings which Christian esoteric teaching calls angels, angeloi, while for the sons of fire it uses the expression archangels, archangeloi. These sons of twilight develop in the ancestor of man a kind of understanding of which, however, in his dull consciousness he himself cannot yet make use. Through this understanding, exalted entities now again reveal themselves as previously the seraphim did through the sensory germs. Through the human bodies, understanding is now poured out over the planet by those spirits whom Christian esoteric teaching calls cherubim. Around the middle of the seventh Saturn cycle, a new activity begins. Man has now reached the point where he can work unconsciously on his own material body. Through his activity in the utter dullness of Saturn existence, man produces the first germinal predisposition to the true spirit man, who reaches his full development only at the end of the development of mankind. In theosophical literature, this is called Atma. It is the highest member of the so-called monad of man. In itself, it would be quite dull and unconscious at this stage. But as the seraphim and the cherubim reveal themselves out of their free will in the two preceding human stages, so the thrones now reveal themselves, those beings who, at the very beginning of Saturn existence, radiated the human body out of their own nature. the germinal predisposition of spirit man, Atma, is completely penetrated by the power of these spirits of will, and retains this power through all subsequent stages of development. In his dull consciousness at this stage, man as yet cannot realize anything of this germinal predisposition, but he develops further, and later this germinal predisposition becomes clear to his own consciousness. This work is not yet completed at the end of the life of Saturn. It continues into the first sun cycle. One should consider that the labor of the higher spirits, which has been described here, does not coincide with the beginning and end of a smaller cycle, of a round, but that it continues from the middle of one to the middle of the next. Its greatest activity is developed in the periods of rest between the cycles. It increases from the middle of a cycle, Manvantara, onward, becomes strongest in the middle of a period of rest, Pralaya, and then ebbs in the next. It has already been mentioned in the preceding chapters that life by no means ceases during the periods of rest. From the above, it also becomes apparent in what sense Christian esoteric science says that in the beginning of time, the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones first revealed themselves. With this, the course of Saturn has been followed to the time where its life develops through a period of rest into that of the sun. Of this we shall speak in the following discussions. For the sake of greater clarity, here we shall give a summary of the facts of development of the first planet. This planet is the one on which the dullest human consciousness develops, a deep trance consciousness. Together with this, the first rudiment of the physical human body develops. This development passes through 7 subsidiary stages, smaller cycles or rounds. At each of these stages, higher spirits begin their work on the development of the human body, namely in the first cycle, the spirits of will, thrones. Second cycle, the spirits of wisdom, dominions. Third cycle, the spirits of motion, principalities. Fourth cycle, the spirits of form, powers. Fifth cycle, the spirits of personality, primal beginnings. Sixth cycle, the spirits of the sons of fire, archangels. Seventh cycle, the spirits of the sons of twilight, angels. In the fourth cycle, the spirits of personality raise themselves to the stage of humanity. From the fifth cycle onward, the seraphim reveal themselves. From the sixth cycle onward, the cherubim reveal themselves. From the seventh cycle onward, the thrones, the true creators of man, reveal themselves. Through the latter revelation, there develops in the seventh cycle of the first planet the predisposition to the spiritual man, to Atma,